How often have you watched a detective show and thought, come on, that's just too perfect? A single, almost invisible clue that cracks the whole case wide open. It feels like something straight out of a Hollywood script, right? Well, today, we're diving into a real-life story that proves truth can be even more astonishing than fiction. This is the incredible tale of how one tiny, overlooked detail finally brought a cunning criminal to justice after years of evading the law. Get ready, because this story will make you rethink everything you know about solving crimes. It all began in the quiet, unsuspecting suburbs of Sacramento, California. Back in the late 1970s, a terrifying shadow fell over the community, a predator who moved silently in the night. He was known as the East Area Rapist, a phantom who would break into homes, terrorize families, and then vanish without a trace. For years, he was a ghost, leaving behind a trail of fear but almost no usable evidence. The police were stumped. They had witnessed descriptions, but they were vague and often contradictory. They had a modus operandi, but the perpetrator was maddeningly careful, often wearing a mask and gloves. The reign of terror didn't stop in Northern California. The attacks suddenly ceased there, only to reemerge in the southern part of the state, this time with a horrifying escalation. The attacker, now dubbed the original Night Stalker, wasn't just assaulting his victims. He was murdering them. The crime spree spanned over a decade, from 1974 to 1986, leaving at least 13 dead and more than 50 survivors of assault. The scale of his crimes was immense, and the emotional toll on the communities was immeasurable. Investigators from different counties and agencies worked tirelessly, but the cases grew cold. The attacker was like a ghost, his identity a complete mystery. DNA technology was in its infancy, and while they eventually collected genetic material from several crime scenes, there was no one to match it to. The case files swelled with reports, dead-end leads, and the heartbroken testimonies of victims. The unknown monster became a dark legend, a boogeyman that haunted California for decades. He was given a new, more encompassing name, the Golden State Killer. Years turned into decades. The original investigators retired, new ones took their place, but the case remained stubbornly unsolved. The Golden State Killer seemed to have committed the perfect crimes and simply disappeared. Victims' families lived in a state of suspended grief, never knowing who was responsible for their pain. It seemed like justice would never be served. But then, a new generation of investigators, armed with revolutionary technology, decided to take another look. One of them was a cold case investigator named Paul Holes. Paul Holes had been obsessed with the case for over 20 years. He lived and breathed the details, poring over old files, re-interviewing witnesses, and chasing down every ghost of a lead. He knew the key had to be in the DNA, but the National Criminal Database CODIS had no matches. This is where the story takes a turn that no one could have predicted. It wasn't about finding a match in a police database anymore. It was about thinking outside the box. Way outside the box. In the mid-2010s, consumer genetic genealogy websites were becoming incredibly popular. People were spitting into tubes and sending their DNA off to companies like 23andMe and Ancestor DNA to discover their heritage and find long-lost relatives. These public databases were growing exponentially, creating a massive, searchable web of genetic connections. And it was here, in this public treasure trove of DNA, that Holes and his team saw a glimmer of hope. They thought, what if the killer, or one of his relatives, had uploaded their DNA to one of these sites? It was a long shot, a needle-in-a-haystack approach that had never been used to solve a major violent crime before. They decided to use a public genealogy website called GEDmatch, where users could upload their raw DNA data from other sites to find relatives. In 2017, they uploaded the crime scene DNA profile. Didn't get a direct hit. The Golden State Killer wasn't in the database, but they did get something else, something that would change everything. A list of distant relatives. The killer shared a common ancestor with a handful of people on the site. They were third, fourth, and fifth cousins. This was the single clue. It wasn't a fingerprint. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a witness. It was a faint genetic echo from the past, a link to a great-grandparent from the 1800s. This was the start of an incredibly complex and painstaking process. Using this tiny genetic link, investigators, with the help of genealogist Barbara Raventer, began building a massive family tree. They worked backward from the distant cousins, tracing their ancestry to find the common ancestor, and then worked forward, branching out through generations, trying to find every single descendant. Imagine the work involved. They were mapping out a family tree that spanned nearly 2 centuries and included hundreds, if not thousands, of people. They had to account for every birth, death, and marriage. They slowly narrowed down the possibilities. They were looking for a male who would have been in the right age range and in the right locations in California during the crime spree. One by one, they eliminated branches of the family tree. The suspect couldn't be from this line because they lived in another state. He couldn't be from that line because he was too young. After months of this grueling genealogical detective work, they narrowed it down to a small handful of suspects. And one name stood out: Joseph James D'Angelo. He was a former police officer who had been fired in 1979 for shoplifting. He was the right age, and he had lived in the exact areas where the East Area rapist and original Night Stalker had been active. The pieces were falling into place. The profile was a terrifyingly perfect fit, but they still needed definitive proof. They needed his DNA to compare directly to the crime scene evidence. So, the surveillance began. Investigators secretly followed the 72-year-old D'Angelo. They needed to collect a sample of his DNA without him knowing. Their first attempt was from the door handle of his car, but the sample wasn't good enough. They kept watching, waiting for an opportunity, and then they got it. An investigator watched as D'Angelo threw a tissue into a trash can outside a Hobby Lobby store. They retrieved it. So the lab results came back, and it was a perfect match. The DNA on the tissue was the same as the DNA left at crime scenes decades earlier. On April 24, 2018, nearly 44 years after his first known crime, police descended on Joseph James D'Angelo's suburban home. The ghost who had haunted California for a generation was finally caught. The single clue, a distant genetic connection on a public website, had unraveled a mystery that had stumped law enforcement for decades. D'Angelo eventually pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and numerous other charges to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The story of the Golden State Killer's capture is a landmark case. It ushered in a new era of forensic investigation, using genetic genealogy to solve dozens of other cold cases across the country. It shows how creativity, persistence, and the power of new technology can bring light to the darkest of places. A single clue, a digital breadcrumb in a sea of data, was all it took to finally give the victims and their families the justice they had waited so long for. It's a powerful reminder that no case is ever truly cold, and no secret is safe forever. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true crime stories. See you in the next one.